What would you do if everything you owned fit inside a canvas satchel, and the only thing of value you carried was a tool that no longer had hands to hold it? What if the one person who believed in you was gone, and all that remained was the work they had left behind? Half-finished, misunderstood, waiting. They called Sable Morrow foolish for taking on the old Timmins ferry house at the bend of the Acheron River. They said the girl had river mud for brains, that she'd freeze before December, that a 22-year-old with ink-stained fingers and a dead woman's awl had no business trying to bind a future out of a place the water had been slowly swallowing for 30 years. Find a quiet place to settle in tonight, and let us tell you what they couldn't see from where they were standing. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from this evening as we share the story of Sable Morrow and the forgotten ferry house on Acheron Bend. Sable had arrived in the town of Carroway Landing on the last coach of October, the kind of gray, biting afternoon that felt like the sky had already given up on the year. She had no luggage worth naming, a canvas satchel, a bedroll bound with twine, and the leather satchel within the satchel, the one she never set down, the one that held her knives, her bone folders, her needles and waxed linen thread, and the awl that had belonged to Dorothea Finch. Dorothea had been a bookbinder, not a hobbyist, not a weekend crafter, a true bookbinder, the kind who could rebind a 200-year-old psalter without leaving a single ghost mark on the spine. She had taken Sable in at 14, a girl the county had stopped keeping track of, and she had handed her a bone folder and said, without preamble, "Press here, feel when it gives." That was the beginning of Sable's education. 8 years of pressing, feeling, stitching, gilding. 8 years of learning that broken things could be made whole if you knew where the structure was hiding. Dorothea had died in early spring, a quiet death, in her sleep which suited her. She had been a quiet woman who found noise wasteful. She left Sable the tools, the half-finished orders, and a folded note that said only, "Finish what I started, then start what I couldn't." There was no money, there was no shop. The building had been rented. The landlord, a man named Crawford Beale, had given Sable 2 weeks before he let the space to someone else. She had spent those 2 weeks completing every outstanding order, returning each book to its owner, with Dorothea's name still on the receipt. Then she had packed the tools, shouldered the satchel, and stepped out into a spring that already felt like it was ending. She had drifted for 6 months. Odd work. A little hand-stitching for a printer in Tiverton. Rebinding hymnals for a church outside Morden. She had saved what she could, which was not much. She had heard of Carroway Landing from a wagon driver, who said it was quiet, said there was no one there doing fine bookwork, said the nearest binder was 2 towns east, and not particularly skilled. He had said this the way people say things they think are useful, not understanding that what he had described was exactly the kind of gap Sable had been trained to find. The town hadn't been expecting her, which was fine. She hadn't been expecting much from the town either. Her only contact was a woman named Bertha Voss, who ran the dry goods and had exchanged 3 letters with Sable over the summer, after Sable had responded to a notice on a community board in Tiverton. Bertha was a practical woman with a practical face, the kind of person who assessed situations quickly and without sentiment. She met Sable at the coach stop, looked her up and down once, and said, "You're younger than I thought." "I get that," Sable said. Bertha nodded toward the river road. "Come in and have some tea. We'll talk about what's available." What was available in Carroway Landing for a young woman with $24, and a trade that most people in town had never had occasion to require, was, by any reasonable accounting, not much. The rooming house was full for the winter. The 2 available properties in town were asking prices she couldn't meet. Bertha mentioned a room above the cooperage, but the cooper, a stout man named Hugh Quellet, was not interested in a female tenant, which he said plainly, without apology. Sable drank her tea and listened. She had learned, from years of working with her hands, that the most useful thing you could do in an uncertain situation was be still and let the information come to you. "There's the ferry house," Bertha said, almost as an afterthought, "the way you mention something you don't seriously mean." She refilled the kettle. "Down at the bend. Old Timmins property. Been empty since the family cleared out in, oh, it must be 94 now, 18 years. The ferry hasn't run since before that. The house went with it." "Is it standing?" Sable asked. Bertha gave her a look. "After a fashion. Whose deed is it?" "Municipal. Taxes lapsed years ago. You'd have to speak to the reeve." She paused, studying the girl across from her. "Sable, it's on the flood line. The back half is rotted clear through. The river took the dock. There are families in this town who've lived here 40 years and wouldn't set foot in that house." "Why not?" Bertha wrapped her hands around her cup. "They say it's unlucky. The last ferryman, old Timmins, he went peculiar toward the end. Wouldn't let anyone near the property. Used to say the river was trying to tell him something, and he was the only one listening. She set down her cup. People remember things like that. It follows a place. Sable was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Could I look at it?" Berta took her down the river road herself, which Sable suspected was not because she wanted to help so much as because she was curious to see what a 22-year-old with a canvas satchel would make of a thing the town had decided was hopeless. The ferry house sat at the bend where the Acheron River curved south, and it was, in the particular light of that late October afternoon, one of the loneliest-looking structures Sable had ever seen. The main building was a squat, heavy-timbered thing with a steep roof, some of it intact, some of it fallen, and a stone chimney at the north end that still stood straight. The back half of the building had suffered worst from the damp. The floor had buckled. The rear wall leaned at an angle that suggested conversation with the ground rather than defiance of it, and the window frames were bare of glass and full of bird nests. 30-year-old river willow had grown up against the east wall, root tendrils working their way through the foundation stones. The dock was gone. A few rotted pilings stood in the shallows, knee-deep in brown November water. But the chimney stood. The north half of the roof held, and the walls, the main walls, the front walls, were river stone, a foot thick, pointed with mortar that had held through 18 winters of frost. Berta stood back and watched as Sable walked the perimeter, pressing her palm against the stonework the way Dorothea had taught her to press the spine of a book, feeling for what was still solid underneath the damage. "It's nothing," Berta said, not unkindly. "You understand that. The foundation's dry," Sable said. "Over here, the foundation, the rest of it, the chimney's intact, the north wall, that's where I'd sleep anyway." Sable turned back to look at the building. The wind off the river was sharp enough to make her eyes water. "What's the tax deed on it?" Berta made a sound that might have been a laugh, if she had been a woman who laughed easily. $30. Sable did the arithmetic quickly. $24 was not 30. It was not close to 30. "When does the Reeve hold office hours?" she said. The Reeve was a man named Prosper Langham, which was either the most appropriate or the most ironic name possible, for the administrator of a town that managed its prosperity carefully and shared it only with those it had decided deserved it. He received Sable in the small municipal hall the following morning, looked at her the way people look at something they are deciding whether to take seriously, and asked what her trade was. When she told him, he repeated it. "Bookbinding." "Yes, we don't have a I'm aware. That's why I'm here." He laced his fingers on the desk. He was not an unkind man, she could see that, but he was a careful one, and careful men took time. He asked about her experience. She told him. He asked who had trained her. She told him about Dorothea. He paused at the name, as people occasionally did. Dorothea Finch had been known, in certain circles, as someone who knew her craft. In the end, he dropped the deed price to $20 on the grounds that the property was a liability to the municipality and had been for over a decade. It was not charity, he was careful to explain. It was practicality. Sable paid him $20. She had $4 left. She had the deed. She had the awl. She had the stone walls of a river house that the town had already written off as a bad ending. And for the first time since Dorothea had died, she felt something that was not grief. It was small and unfamiliar, more like the memory of purpose than purpose itself. But it was there. She walked back down the river road, with the deed folded against her chest and the wind in her face. And if the people, standing outside the tax shop or watching from the cooperage window, thought she looked like someone who had just made a serious mistake, she didn't stop to correct them. News moved through Carroway Landing the way it moves through any small town that doesn't have enough else to occupy itself. Quickly, thoroughly, and with a great deal of embellishment. By that afternoon, it was known that the Morrow girl had bought the old ferry house. By evening, the known facts had acquired a coating of opinion that made them almost unrecognizable. At the feed store, two men who had delivered grain past that bend for 20 years agreed that the back wall would go in the first hard frost. At the rooming house, the landlady told anyone who would listen that she had offered Sable a perfectly good room, and the girl had refused it, which was not strictly accurate but made a better story. Even Hugh Quellet, who had turned Sable away from the cooperage without ceremony, found occasion to mention her purchase to a customer in a tone of voice that communicated significant doubt about her judgment. The voice that carried furthest, however, belonged to Jerome Pell. Jerome Pell was the man who owned the other side of the Acheron Bend, the commercial side, the mill, the weighing dock, the rental of the 2 riverside warehouses. He was a wide, ruddy-faced man who carried his authority the way some men carry extra weight, as though it were simply part of him now, settled in for the long term. He had tried to acquire the Ferry house property 3 years earlier, Berta mentioned quietly, because the bend gave whoever held it a natural advantage over river access. Not the dock, which was gone, but the sight lines, and in winter, the ice road that formed along the shallower curve. He found Sable the following morning, tying off the canvas she had stretched over the worst of the exposed roofline to keep the interior dry enough to work in. He came on horseback. He didn't dismount. "Miss Morrow," he said, making her name sound like a category of error. "I heard you took the Timmins deed." She didn't stop what she was doing. "That's right." He surveyed the building with the expression of a man who has decided the outcome of an auction before it started. "I offered the municipality $40 for it 2 years ago. They were holding out." He let that sit. "I understand you paid 20. "I did? You know why I wanted it?" "I can make a reasonable guess." He smiled, the kind of smile that has very little warmth in it. "I'll give you 30. You'd walk away with $10 profit and no winter on a riverbank in a building that's going to collapse under the snow load." Sable finished tying off the corner of the canvas. She climbed down from the crate she'd been standing on and looked at him. He was a big man on a big horse, and she was a young woman with a canvas satchel and $4 to her name, and she was aware that the tableau probably looked a particular way from the outside. "No thank you," she said. He had not been expecting that. She could see it in the small stillness that crossed his face before the smile came back. "It'll be a hard winter. Most winters are. The ice road," he said. "When it forms on the bend, whoever holds both banks controls the crossing. You understand that." "I understand it." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, with a kind of deliberate condescension that she suspected he used on people he had decided were temporary, "I'll be here in January, Miss Morrow, when you've changed your mind. The offer will be lower." He rode back toward the mill without waiting for an answer, leaving Sable with the river sound and the smell of cold stone and the particular quality of silence that follows when someone has said something they expect to be the last word. She stood there for a moment, the wind off the water, pressing cold fingers against her face. Her hands were numb. She had $4 and a collapsing building and a man who controlled the commercial river trade already mapping out how long she would last. She went back to work. The first month was the hardest kind of hard, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically but simply grinds. Sable's days began before light and ended when her lantern oil ran out. She had no assistant. She had no neighbor who came by to help. She had the tools, the knowledge Dorothea had put in her hands over 8 years, and the particular stubbornness that develops in people who have learned that they can only count on what they carry with them. She cleared the collapsed timber from the back section of the house first, piece by piece, stacking what was salvageable and burning what wasn't. She chinked the gaps in the north wall with a mixture of river clay and lime she'd found in a forgotten sack in the loft. Still good, hard and fine. The roof she couldn't manage alone, not the structural timbers, but she was able to clear the debris, identify the sound sections, and lay additional canvas and split cedar shingles over the worst spots to get through the winter. The floor in the main room, the north room, the one she was making habitable, was wide plank pine, some boards sprung, most still sound. She pulled the bad ones, replaced them with planks broken down from the collapsed wall framing, fitted and pegged them the way she'd seen a carpenter work once in Tiverton, just watching. She had never built anything before in her life except books, but a book, Dorothea had always said, is just structure and patience. You can apply that anywhere. She made a work table from 2 sawhorses and a door she found half buried under a collapsed shed out back. She swept the hearth clean and lit the first fire on a night when the temperature dropped sharply enough to make the river stones of the wall groan. The warmth that came from that fire, the first real warmth the building had held in 18 years, felt significant in a way she couldn't quite name. Like the difference between a book that's been water-damaged and left to dry wrong, and one that's been carefully pressed back into its proper shape. She began working again. She had brought paper, boards, cloth, glue, and her thread, enough for modest projects. She let it be known through Berta that she was available for bookbinding and paper repair. Her first order was a family Bible that a farmer on the North Road had been meaning to have re-spined for 6 years. She sat at her door-plank table and worked by lantern light, her breath visible in the cold, her hands moving in the patterns Dorothea had drilled into her until they were automatic. She finished it in 2 days. It looked, when she was done, as though it had never been damaged. The farmer who came to collect it held it with both hands and didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother had this rebound in Halifax once. It wasn't done this well." She charged him fairly. He paid her, and then, a week later, sent his wife with a collection of old maps that needed backing before they fell apart entirely. There was no flood of business. There was no sudden reversal of fortune. There was the steady, patient accumulation of small things. A folio of legal documents the notary needed protected. A set of agricultural journals belonging to the Historical Society, never catalogued, the covers fragile as dried leaves. A schoolteacher named Agnes Knott, who brought in a personal journal, her late father's, and asked, haltingly, whether anything could be done. The binding was shattered, the signatures loose, the cover water-damaged to the point of unrecognizability. Sable looked at it for a long time, turning it in her hands. "Yes," she said. "It'll take time, but yes." Agnes Knott left it with her, and thanked her 3 times before she reached the door. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire had settled into coals, Sable sometimes found herself running her thumb across the handle of Dorothea's awl. It was a simple thing, turned ash handle, worn to the specific shape of the older woman's grip, steel shaft worn bright at the tip. Not an antique, not a rarity. Just a tool used so long and so well that it had become a record of the hands that had held it. She had begun to explore the building more thoroughly as she cleared it, the way you learn a book by reading it slowly rather than skimming for the ending. The structure had 3 rooms. The main north room, a smaller room behind it that had been a kind of office for the ferry operation, and a lower space at the back, half underground, that she had initially dismissed as too damaged to enter. One afternoon, when the weather was too bitter to work outside, she pulled up the stuck door to the lower room and went down with her lantern. It was dry. That was the first surprise. The walls were double-stoned, she could see, laid with a deliberateness that suggested the builder had thought carefully about water infiltration. The floor was flagstone, swept clean by nothing except 30 years of stillness, and along the wall, built into the stone, were shelves. Plank shelves, thick ones, the kind you build when you mean things to last. They were not empty. Stacked along the shelves, wrapped in oilcloth of varying states of decay, were books. Not many, perhaps 40 or 50 volumes, but books. Carefully placed, spine in as though against light, some wrapped individually, some in groups. Someone had put them here with intent. Someone had thought about what they were doing. She lifted the nearest bundle and unwrapped the oilcloth with hands that had gone very still and careful, the way they went when she could feel that something mattered. The book inside was a natural history of North American freshwater systems. Handwritten annotations filled the margins. Pencil, careful, tiny, in a hand she didn't recognize. The next bundle contained a collection of pressed plant specimens, each mounted on heavy paper, each labeled in both English and what appeared to be Cree syllabics. The next held a leather folio of hand-drawn maps, river surveys, precise and beautiful. She sat down on the flagstone floor and kept unwrapping. By the time the lantern had burned down a quarter, she had understood what she was looking at. These were not a ferryman's effects. The last Timmins had been barely literate, according to Berta. These had come before him, or had been left by someone passing through. The marginalia in the natural history was consistent across several volumes. The same hand, the same particular system of notation. She found, tucked into the back of the largest folio, a folded paper that had been part of a letter, the top and bottom torn away, so only the middle section survived. The river surveys are as complete as I can make them, without a second season. I have left the collection here because I cannot carry it further, and I trust the stone room will keep it better than I could on the road. If anyone finds this, if you are someone who knows what you are looking at, please understand that the mapping of the northern tributaries in the blue folio is accurate to 1883 and has not, to my knowledge, been recorded elsewhere. The plant specimens are keyed to my field notes. They should not be separated from. It ended there. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long time listening to the river sound through the stone. Whoever had left these things had been a careful person, a person who thought about the future readers of their work, who wrapped books against damp and wrote in margins and mapped rivers no one else had mapped. A person working alone, probably, the way serious people so often work, quietly, without recognition, trusting that the work itself was worth doing even if no one was watching. The survey maps, the pressing collection, the annotated natural history, none of it famous, none of it celebrated, all of it done with tremendous care and left in a stone room by a bend in the Acheron River, waiting. She began to understand why this place had called to her. The following weeks were a kind of education. She worked during the days and read in the evenings, moving through the volumes in the dry room with the same methodical care she brought to a damaged binding. Slowly, attentive to what the work was trying to tell her. The field notes she found folded into the plant. Folio matched the marginalia in the natural history. The river maps in the blue folio covered the Acheron watershed in a level of detail she had never seen in any printed chart. Some of the tributaries on those maps did not appear on the municipal survey she'd borrowed from the Reeves office. They were too far north, too shallow, documented in a season when someone had gone looking for information that no one else had thought worth collecting. She didn't know yet what all of it meant, but she began to pay attention to the river in a different way. She watched the ice come in, the particular patterns it made at the bend. She noted which of the tributary mouths had flow when the main channel slowed. She found herself comparing what she could see from the bank against what was drawn in the blue folio, which was more accurate than anything else she'd found, and more complete. December arrived and the town mostly ignored her, which was not the same as accepting her. The few customers she had were enough to keep her in flour and lamp oil, and the occasional luxury of candles. She was not comfortable, she was not secure, but she had the stone walls and the fire and the dry room full of something she did not yet fully understand. And she went to sleep each night feeling, despite everything, like someone at the beginning of something rather than the end. The ice road formed early that year. Jerome Pell had it cleared and packed within a week. His teams working the south bank, pressing the crossing right up to the edge of what would have been the ferry's jurisdiction. There was nothing technically wrong with it. He had every right to the south bank. But the natural crossing point, the shallow curve where the river bent and the ice thickened first, ran directly in front of the ferry house property. He had to skirt it, slightly. Not much, but enough that his road was 15 feet longer than it needed to be, and the angle was awkward for heavy loads. He sent a man to see her in January, as he had promised. The offer was $22, $2 profit on her investment. She told the man to thank Mr. Pell for his time. The man looked around at the stone walls, the work table, the fire, the stacked and ordered tools, the volumes she had brought up from the dry room, and was working to stabilize. He looked at Sable herself, hands stained with glue and red clay, hair pinned back with one of Dorothea's old bone folders because she'd misplaced her pins, the awl hanging at her belt like a worker's badge. "He won't come up again," the man said, not unkindly. "I know," she said. When the man had gone, she went back to her work. The collection kept giving things up as she knew it better. In a bundle she had initially dismissed as blank stock paper, she found 40 pages of close-written notes on the ecology of the northern Acheron tributaries. Which fish ran which channels, which months, which plants grew on which banks and why. Information that was specific, detailed and, she was increasingly certain, genuinely useful to anyone managing the river fishery or the spring log drive. The notary in town, a serious man named Uldrich Harp, had mentioned in passing that the survey records for the upper watershed were badly incomplete, and that the lumber interests had been commissioning new surveys at considerable expense. She took the blue folio and the field notes to Uldrich Harp's office on a Tuesday morning in February. He looked at the folio for a long time. He turned the pages slowly. He read several entries in the field notes, then went back and read them again. He took off his glasses, polished them, and put them back on, as if perhaps they had been responsible for what he was seeing. "Where did you find this?" he said. She told him about the dry room, the stone shelves, the oilcloth bundles. "I need to make some inquiries," he said carefully. "There may be people who want to see this. May I show it to the land surveyor when he comes through in March?" "On condition that it comes back to me," she said, "and that whatever it contributes to is acknowledged properly." He looked at her. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Agreed," he said. She walked home along the river road, with empty hands, and the cold light of February on the ice. And she thought about the person who had written those notes, surveyed those channels, pressed those plants, and labeled them in 2 languages, and left all of it in a stone room under a collapsing building, because they had trusted that, somewhere, eventually, someone would know what to do with it. March arrived the way. March arrives in that part of the country, grudgingly, in stages, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes before surrendering anywhere else. The land surveyor came through and spent an afternoon with the folio. He made copies of 3 charts and wrote a letter to the provincial office that Uldrich Harp read to Sable in full, in which the surveyor described the collection as containing the most accurate, pre-1900 mapping of the northern Acheron tributary system he had encountered, significantly more detailed than existing records and potentially of significant value to the current resource planning initiative for the watershed. 2 weeks after that, a logging company representative arrived in Carroway Landing asking to purchase copies of the tributary maps. Uldrich negotiated on Sable's behalf. The arrangement was modest by large company standards. The originals remained with Sable. Copies were made under her supervision. Proper attribution was given. But it was enough. Enough to repair the roof properly with hired help. Enough to replace the worst of the rear wall and install a proper window in the north room. Enough to feel, for the first time, like someone who might still be here in a year. The spring brought other things. A letter from the university at Halifax, acknowledging the collection in response to an inquiry Uldrich had made, and expressing interest in the plant specimens and field notes. An article in a naturalist journal, brief and technical, that mentioned the Acheron survey collection, and, in a footnote, noted that it was held by a private owner in Carroway Landing, who had retrieved it from the original site and was preserving it appropriately. People in town read the article. Berta brought a copy to Sable without comment, which was its own kind of comment. The Historical Society came to her. Then the school, asking if she would speak to the senior students about the collection and about bookbinding as a preservation practice. She said yes to both. She was not a natural public speaker. But she found, standing in front of 15-16-year-olds, with one of the pressed plant specimens in her hands, that she knew what she was talking about, well enough that it didn't matter. Agnes Knott brought back her father's journal, newly rebound, and cried in the doorway, which Sable had not been prepared for and handled awkwardly, which Agnes seemed to find endearing. Jerome Pell did not come back. His ice road had served him well enough through the winter, and when the spring melt ran he had other concerns. He passed her on the river road once, on horseback, and nodded, not warmly, not in acknowledgement of anything in particular, just the nod of a man who has recalibrated an estimate. She nodded back. That was all. By summer, the Ferry house no longer looked like a building that had given up. The roof was sound. The rear wall was rebuilt in the same river stone as the original. Sable, having learned enough from watching the mason she'd hired to help with the work that she could now point accurately at where the joints needed reinforcing. The willow that had been growing against the east wall was cleared back, though she kept the largest tree, the one that had seated itself years ago in the shelter of the stone. Because it was healthy and she had developed over the winter a feeling for things that persisted in difficult conditions. She had hung a sign, plain painted board, Morrow Bindery, book repair and conservation. It was not a grand enterprise. It was not what most people would have called a success, not yet, maybe not for years. But on a warm June morning when the river was low and the light was the particular clear gold of early summer in the north, Sable sat at her work table with the door open and the sound of the water coming in, and she looked at the awl hanging on its peg beside the table, worn ash handle and bright tip, and felt something she hadn't found a word for yet. Uldrich Harp stopped by that morning on some pretense about paperwork and stood in the doorway looking at the workshop, the shelves of materials, the dry room door standing open, now that she had fitted it properly and catalogued its contents, the tidy stack of current commissions on the end of the table. "You've made something here," he said. It sounded like he meant it. Sable looked around at the stone saws, the fire laid but not yet lit, the river through the open door. She thought about the unknown surveyor who had filled a stone room with careful work and trusted it to outlast them. She thought about Dorothea, who had handed a 14-year-old a bone folder and said, "Press here, feel when it gives." She thought that what she had built here was not an exception to anything. It was the continuation of something that had been going before she arrived and would go on after her. "I just learned to read the building," she said. "The rest was already here." If this story reached you tonight, if Sable's quiet stubbornness stirred something in you, we'd love to know. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about holding on to what's worth holding, share this with them. We'll be here at Cottage Stories with another tale. Whenever you're ready to settle in.